Welcome.
Welcome.
Welcome to First Parish, Unitarian Universalist of Arlington.
We choose.
We choose.
We choose to be
A liberal religious community.
Welcoming.
Welcoming to all.
We encourage each other
on our spiritual journeys.
Support one another.
Through the changes in our lives.
And challenge the excesses
and injustices of our time.
Called to love.
To love.
To love.
And upheld by joy.
We live our faith.
Sometimes things are fuzzy and unclear. And sometimes I want to reach for my phone and scroll, thinking I'm connecting, but I'm not really. It's because I don't know what else to do to fill a void. It is during these times that, if I am lucky, I think to say a prayer, a yearning for a deeper connection. Join me now in the spirit of prayer. Spirit of love and life, help us to sit in stillness. In our days filled with achievements, we may be too preoccupied to notice a smile, a compliment, or an effort on someone else's part to reach out and connect with us. May we remember to see and value each person in our day, knowing that a kind word can make all the difference. There are those who are in pain today. It may be physical pain or emotional. Gentle Spirit, help the pain ease, make the next step clear, and help those alone to feel companioned. Across the nations of the world, bringer of rain, bringer of wind, bringer of sun, bring about love. Bring a willingness to see another's side without anger. Support those who are worried and afraid, who are unsafe and unable to live freely. Provide comfort to those who are living in war and under threat. Gracious Spirit, help us to see the beauty that surrounds us each day, and especially during this long-awaited autumn. Glowing leaves on afternoon trees, crisp mornings, and clear blue skies. Shine your grace on us so we can shine it towards others in need. In the next 2 minutes of silence, open our awareness. Help us to hear our heart's whisperings.
I offer 2 brief readings this morning. The first is a poem by Alice Lutterman entitled Being Wrong. One of the great unheralded joys of late middle age is the mind-popping sensation of how many things I've been wrong about. Starting with sex, my parents, and the meaning of the word bruschetta. Then gliding on seamlessly to men, marriage, and magic mushrooms. All my firmly held opinions have loosened like teeth in receding gums, or pilings that the indifferent sea has pounded into submission for centuries. What a relief to have been wrong about gluten-free pasta and skinny jeans, gender and white privilege. I suspect I've been wrong about pretty much everything, including death, which will come for everyone except me. Our second reading are words from what I think is the best book I've read on grief recently. I highly recommend it. It's by Francis Weller, and it's entitled The Wild Edge of Sorrow, the Sacred Work of Grief. Francis Weller writes, "My daily practice is to wake and immediately bring my attention to this thought: I am one day closer to my death. So how will I live this day? How will I greet those I meet? How will I bring soul to each moment? I do not want to waste this day. I am one day closer to my death. How will I live this day?" Let us sing together. It is number 19 in the song booklet, Sacred Space. Sometimes our losses come in batches. I have not seen this number of deaths in our community in such a short period of time. In the last 7 weeks, 4 members of the parish have died. Up until the last year or two, as they each battled illness, they had been not just members, but well-known leaders here at First Parish. We remember him standing up during our joys and concerns, our stones ritual, and speaking of great causes. A scientist by training and a strong advocate for climate change awareness, he maintained a blog for many years where he passionately shared news and insights on environmental issues. For years, he served on our Environmental Justice Committee. David Lanskov died September 1st. He was 76. His memorial service is next Sunday afternoon. She led a covenant group for 10 or so years. She stitched and sewed among the best of us, crafting quilts and more for the Harvest Moon Fair. A social worker and the mother of a deaf son, she learned sign language and became an advocate for the deaf community. Yesterday, her son, also a member of First Parish, signed his eulogy for his mother in this very room. The sanctuary was full as hearing and deaf gathered in tribute. Barbara Macaulay died September 23rd. She was 76. She came to First Parish more than 30 years ago, looking for a religious home for her wife and newly arrived infant son. Not one to draw attention to herself, she was a quiet, firm force at First Parish, steering our finances for more than 10 years as our elected treasurer. Working at Boston Medical Center, she was a union captain who advocated for workers' rights. Diane Barry died on September 26th. She was 81. Her memorial service is tomorrow afternoon. She also came to First Parish 30 years ago. She served on the parish committee, the Alliance board, the endowment trustees. She was largely responsible for raising the funds and securing the artists for the crafting of this pulpit and chancel table and your mosaic. Louise Strayhorn died on Monday, October 21st. She was 74. Her memorial service is 3 weeks from today. This morning, we swim amidst uncertain news. This week, Israel attacked Iran. Asheville is still without potable water. Violence ravages Ukraine and Haiti. And we are 9 days away from a presidential election. We have written postcards, made phone calls to get out the vote, and some of us have traveled to Pennsylvania. So much seems at stake. Amidst the news cycles, death comes like a wake-up call that whatever unfolds, you and I know our days and the days of our loved ones are numbered. I think of the dirt I have held in my hand as I've helped to bury the ashes of our loved ones in the courtyard, there just beyond the glass window at the back of the sanctuary. It is a place of mourning, as well as picnics and children's play. 10 years ago, when Chris Jones died, I remember his then young child, Alana, reading a poem for their father, and then climbing the apple tree and remaining there perched in the tree through the entire committal service. At every graveside, I hearken to the Jewish tradition, saying that it is an act of love and respect for one's loved ones to care for their body right to the end. And the placing of the body in the earth and the placing of dirt over the hole is an act of tenderness reserved for one's intimates. When Dave Turkla, a former chair of our parish committee, died, I remember kneeling on the ground beside two of his young granddaughters. Those two little girls took dirt in their tiny hands, and handful by handful, bit by bit, the three of us fully covered their grandfather's ashes. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. A woman once reflected on her battle with breast cancer, how her experience affected the way she now lived. She said, "When I am faced with a decision, big or small, I find myself asking, what if I only have 5 years? It may sound morbid, but it's not a bad measure," she says. "And so I do fewer things that I don't want to, and I can much more easily say no." In the Middle Ages, people would greet each other with these words, memento mori. Instead of good morning, memento mori. Remember death. The awareness of death greeted people every day. And in the art of the time, the specter of death is forever present in tapestries, sculpture, paintings. A human form is split down the middle, one half a beautiful young woman and the other a skeleton. Memento mori was issued not with fear, but as a greeting. Is such an attitude gruesome, or is there wisdom in it? I would argue that an intense awareness of death can teach us how to live. But we live in a culture that denies death. To some extent, this denial has come with changes in the last 100 years or so. A marked decrease in the number of deaths at an early age, the development of specialized professions for the care of the dying, the increased geographical mobility, and the result that most of us live at some distance from aging and dying relatives, and the growth of separate communities for the aging. And so we are not only less familiar with death, we are more uneasy about it. We are awkward around the dying and the grieving. We do not know what to say. And our language is filled with euphemisms about death. We say someone has passed away. We say we've lost someone. When two people discuss life insurance, one typically says to the other, "If something should happen to me," and not, "when I die." Our language betrays us. We are as uncomfortable with the words of death and dying as an earlier generation was with the language of sexuality. But truth is, we are all going to die. Socrates' counsel was to know thyself, and above all, that means to know ourselves as mortal. The irony is that when we allow ourselves to be intensely aware of our mortality, we do not become frantic. Instead, we know a kind of serenity, and we are able to feel the exquisite luxuriousness of life itself. Shortly after the famous psychologist Abraham Maslow suffered a near-fatal heart attack, he wrote a letter. "The confrontation with death makes everything look so precious, so sacred, so beautiful, that I feel more strongly than ever the impulse to live it, to embrace it, and to let myself be overwhelmed by it. My river has never looked so beautiful. Death, with its ever-present possibility, makes greater love possible. It is the contemplation of our own death that can teach us how to live, how to make good and wise choices for ourselves and for the world." What can we say about death? Death is decisive in its absolute certainty and equality. Death comes to everyone, and it renders us all equal. It obliterates the distinctions that we make so much of in life. And death is decisive in its radical uncertainty. You and I do not know when or how we will die, whether today, next month, or a generation from now. The radical uncertainty of death, the notion that we could perhaps die today, marks the moment precious. And that radical uncertainty of death can free us from procrastination, the illusion that we have an infinite amount of time, that we can put off living until some future date, after graduation, or after financial security is obtained, or after a particular project is completed, or after a special relationship is established. Death teaches us about the wise use of time, the difference between activities that are not intrinsically meaningful and those that are essential, the difference between activities that are simply goal-oriented and those in which the process is valuable and does not depend on completion for its meaningfulness or enjoyment. I remember sitting at David Turkla's bedside as he was dying 4 years ago last week. He had difficulty breathing, but even amidst the gasps, he made a point of telling me, his minister, that he had mailed in his ballot. To the very end, Dave had a clear sense of what was important to him. He wanted to vote in that presidential election. One more word on death, and it's a relatively recent learning for me. An awareness of death can bring us back to the holy, to God, if you will. There are those for whom death is cause to turn away from God, but that has not been true for me. Instead, when I feel its full poignancy, death makes me aware of my own finitude and fills me with a yearning for the infinite. Remembering death, I am more open to the presence of all that is life-giving in the world. Memento mori. A woman was waiting in the checkout line of a bookstore a while after her husband's death. By then, she had eaten all of the casseroles from the freezer, and the cards had stopped coming. Yet she was still trying to find solace by reading memoirs of life after death. She couldn't bring herself to read anything else, and she had her latest selection in hand. A casual friend walked up and stood behind her in line. He spoke, hesitating, and began to reintroduce himself to her. "I know who you are," she said, with unintentional bluntness. At the time, she didn't have any patience for trivial conversations. And what did he do? He simply took her in his arms, the way you'd hug a child, took the book from her hands, and paid for it. It was a spontaneous kindness that cost him $20. He says he's forgotten it, but she still remembers 14 years later. We never know what will matter to someone fighting a private battle with grief. Keep in mind that though the depths of grief will pass eventually, the gratitude for what you did will not. Today, I think about Celia and Miguel, Jim and Sean, Andrew, Sarah and Corey, and all those who are grieving a fresh loss. And I think of so many of you who have grieved over beloveds now gone. This is what I know about grief and have witnessed as others have traversed the territories of grief. When a close one dies, who we thought we were can die as well. When parents die, we are no longer a child. When a partner dies, we are no longer a partner. When a sibling dies, we are no longer their sibling. And our place in the order of things shifts. And it takes a while for a new self, a new understanding of ourselves to rise, often haltingly from the ashes. To tell a person not to grieve, to move on, denies them the right to reevaluate their lives, to treasure the past, and to accompany them through their new fears. Let us help the grieving remake themselves. To support someone who is grieving is not about fixing their grief, for grief is not something that can be solved. It's a process with no timetable, and it cannot be hurried. It's a process to be tended and lived through, and in a sense is never fully done. Many of you have heard me speak of the process of turning our unbearable grief into bearable sorrow. Unbearable grief becomes bearable sorrow, and that is enough. But to do that, we have to tell our story and have others listen to our stories. The point is to be with them and to let them know that you can imagine a future for them where they are not being constantly knocked over by the inevitable waves of grief. What happens here at First Parish when someone dies? We hold a memorial service, and people gather together, typically telling stories about the sweet, silly, or loving things the person did. We honor their courage, their perseverance, and their contributions to our lives. And we weep over the knowledge that we will never see them again. We honor what loved ones stood for and promise to carry that forward. We acknowledge their flaws and resolve not to repeat them. We find in their lives instructions for what we might appreciate and value in our own lives. The ritual of a memorial service reminds us that the pain of loss is rich and varied, and it reflects our caring and our connection. Imagine, if you will, the feeling of relief. I know I have felt it in my griefs. Imagine the feeling of relief that might flood your whole being if you knew that when you were in the grip of grief, your village would respond to your need. And it would not be out of pity, but out of a realization that every one of us will take our turn at experiencing grief, and we will need one another. In the memorial garden, with loved ones gathered round, I say the familiar words, "We are brought from the dust. To dust we must return." I bend down and pick up a handful of earth and scatter it on top of the ashes now in the whole of the earth. And I say, as I drop the earth, Life begins, life ends, life goes on. All is well. And I remember the children playing in the memorial garden. I close with words I wrote last month at the training I led for our worship associates. After an exercise, I asked each of the worship associates and myself to write down what they trusted to be true, what they believe. And these are the words I wrote on a piece of newsprint. I believe despair needn't last forever, that peace can come to us even amidst loss, chaos, and tragedy, that laughter, especially when shared, can be redemptive, that it has the power to change us and our circumstances. I believe that so much in the world is unfair, and I am called to make things more fair. I believe that delight matters. I have felt a mysterious, invisible love, if only for a moment. And I believe that in the end, I will dissolve into creation, and all will be well. May it be so.